Is this on? Ah.
Good to go.
Hello. All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, whatever time zone you are in. My name is Lean, and I'm here to talk to you about our work, How Should We Measure Filter Bubbles, a regression model and evidence for online news. This is work that we did in a collaboration between the ADRAM Data Lab at the University of Antwerp, SMIT Media Studies at the Vrije Universiteit Brussel, and Frummel, a company that provides news recommender systems as a service. So over the past few years of studying filter bubbles, I've learned that they tend to cause quite a commotion wherever I go. And if I ask you and I ask you if you think filter bubbles exist and what they mean to you, you'll probably say two different things. So before we all start disagreeing, like the people on this slide, let's get a few things out of the way. So for the purpose of this paper and this talk, this is what I mean when I use the term filter bubble: a decrease in the diversity of a user's recommendations over time. If you want to know why exactly we defined a filter bubble in that way, you can read the paper that I linked at the bottom of this slide. But in short, I think for me, the gist of the filter bubble concept is that these recommender systems, they start learning our preferences from our behavior. And the fear is that as they get good at doing this, bam, we're stuck in a world where there's no diversity, there's no discovery, there's no serendipity. Now, I believe that's a pretty dreadful world to be looking at, and I think a lot of the people in this room here will agree with me, or else there wouldn't be so much work on diversification in recommendation or serendipitous recommendation. But we as the RecSys community are not the only people worried about filter bubbles. In news, there's actually quite a lot of people really worried about this filter bubble phenomenon. Policymakers are worried that these filter bubbles that recommender systems could cause could lock us into prior beliefs, and in that way contribute to polarization that is already present in society and harm democracy in the long term. Editors, they share many of these same concerns, but they're also concerned that it will conceal the editorial curation that they do, which they see as an important service they provide to the user, because with that, they're trying to provide you something to discover, something to learn, something you didn't expect. And so filter bubbles would eliminate surprise, which could really harm their brands. And so with this paper, we wanted to validate or alleviate their concerns. And we asked, how should we measure filter bubbles in online news? But before we try answering that question, I want to look at a slightly different one. How can we measure filter bubbles? Because there's very many different types of experiments we could do. Now, when we surveyed the prior empirical work on filter bubbles, we noticed that most of it is either in the upper row of this 2x2 matrix or in the left column. Now, in my opinion, while these types of studies can answer the question, what could happen on these news websites if users behave a certain way, or if the system makes recommendations in a certain way, they cannot really answer the question, what is happening right now on news websites that are already using these news recommender systems. And so because of our ongoing collaboration with Frummel, which gives us access to a lot of recommendation log data, we decided to focus on observational studies in this paper. So this brings me to my first contribution in this work, which is a regression model. Now, why did we list it as a contribution? Well, the idea here with this paper was really not just to provide evidence of what we saw on these two case studies that I'll present later, but also provide a tool for other news organizations to audit their own recommender systems so that they can figure out if they are suffering filter bubbles or not. Okay, so for the mathy people in this audience, this is the model. However, I'm not going to be talking about it in this talk. If you want to learn more, you should just read the paper. I'm going to try to explain to you in words why we came up with this model and how it works. So let's start at the beginning. The core is, of course, that we want to measure whether or not there is a decrease in diversity of recommendations over time. Now, if you were paying attention to the slide, you would have noticed that it says variety, not diversity. So let's talk about diversity first. Well, Diversity has often been approached in the literature on recommender systems as the attribute of things being different, which Sana in her talk last year termed descriptive diversity. But it's actually a very complex, multidimensional thing with lots of different properties. I'll try to explain to you by means of this very simple figure on the slide. So a first question we may have about what we see on the slide is, how many different shapes are there? The answer to that question, if I'm not mistaken, is 6. And it's the variety of shapes on this slide, and the first property of diversity. A second property is balance. How many do we have of each different shape? And how are they balanced, right? Do we have many more of one specific shape than any other? In this case, I think our shapes are pretty well balanced. And the final one is disparity. How different are shapes really? And it's actually the one that's most looked at in the recommender systems literature, in my opinion. And what it is, so for example, we have 2 differently colored hexagons on the slide, which are obviously maybe not so different, but then the triangle and the circle are much more different. That's what disparity is all about. Now, in this work, we focused on variety for the simple reason that it is the easiest to measure, because you can just count. And we'll be looking at balance and disparity in future work. So now that we've talked about diversity, I want to tell you a story about time. Now, you've probably all encountered this comic before at some point in your life. I laughed about it because my life looks a lot like that. And so reality is always different than what you had in mind. And what we see a lot of people do in prior empirical work on filter bubbles is they define their study period and they measure diversity at the beginning of it, and they measure diversity at the end of it. And then our natural assumption as humans is this plan, which is typically linear. But that's not how diversity behaves in the real world, because nothing ever goes according to plan. So what we did in this work is we divided the study period up into different observation windows, computed the variety in each of those, and we use all of those samples in our regression model. This is what it looks like if you do that for a bunch of random users. This graph is also in the paper. And as you can see, there is very little to learn from it at first sight, right? It's kind of all over the place. It's very chaotic. So now that we've talked about this, the core of our regression model, we can start looking at all of the different confounders and covariates that we have in an observational study of real users on a real platform. A first one we looked at is how many recommendations the user was shown in an observation window. And this is what we found. So on the y-axis, you have topic variety. On the x-axis, you have number of recommendations. And as you can see, there's a kind of sublinear relationship between number of recommendations and topic variety. As you are exposed to more article recommendations, so these are unique articles, every recommendation is a unique article, your topic variety goes up. But it has to plateau at some point because there's only so much news relevant at a certain time, right? And so that is what we see in this graph and also in our data. A second one that we looked at is differences between users in their openness to diversity. This has been discussed a lot in the social sciences literature, and I was happy to see that we also found it in our data. So here you see the sort of density, a histogram of the average topic variety of a user across all observation windows they were active in. So we see that it's like the mode is around 5 or 6, but we have users who have an average topic variety of up to 60 topics, which is like really big difference in my opinion. A final one that we looked at is the diversity of the catalog in each observation window. As most of you will probably know, news recommendation has a specific problem of articles having a very short shelf life. They stop being relevant within 48 hours of being published, typically. And this could really also skew your results. So here, again, we see a density plot of the topic variety. We observed across users in a specific observation window. And then if you look at observation window 13 has the highest peak, and then observation window 7 has a much lower peak and is much more spread out towards higher topic variety, showing that more users were exposed to more topics in that week than they were in week 13. All right, so that is the model in its entirety, and that is actually really all this is, but then in words instead of in math. So now I get to our second contribution, which is the evidence. And for that, we did 2 case studies of 2 European news platforms, Western European news platforms. Now, what I find interesting about this is that we try to collect data sets at different points in time to make sure that our findings would generalize across different times. Both of them span multiple months, have 10,000 users or more, and thousands of articles recommended in total. And they both used the same recommendation algorithm, a nearest neighbor-based collaborative filtering algorithm with some proprietary Frummel sauce on top of it. So we studied 2 aspects of normative news diversity. We studied topic variety, for which we used a BER topic model, which resulted in 150 what we call news story chains, which is like COVID lockdowns or COVID vaccinations, local football news. All of those would be different news story chains. And political variety, where we built this giant regular expression that searched for all of the political parties, political leaders in an article, and then mapped those onto specific political parties, which we decided to treat as different viewpoints on certain topics. And so what we found was that topic variety does actually decrease slightly over time across all users, which is evidence of a filter bubble, you could say. But political variety does not meaningfully decrease over time. Topic variety differs slightly between observation windows, but political variety actually differed a lot. And I really mean a lot. Finally, topic variety differs a lot between users then, whereas political variety barely differed between users. If you're interested in learning more, I invite you to read the paper. Thank you for listening, and I'd be happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Lynn. Okay, we already have the first one entering the microphone. You can also use Slido for asking questions, but also use the microphone, but not all at the same time.
Wonderful. Joe Constant, University of Minnesota. Thank you for this work. 2 comments/questions. One of them, I think you did a fine job moving past the question of do we care about a filter bubble and all of that, but I want to take you back there anyway. Because mostly what we worry about when we think about a filter bubble is people being isolated in some weird part of a space where they're unaware of things that everybody else takes for granted. And I'm not sure that the metrics that you've come up with, although it was better as you were talking about political slant, necessarily capture that. And so I'd like to suggest thinking about metrics that in some sense say, if you're not getting recommendations for domains that are popular among the population as a whole, then you've been filtered, or more likely you're in a bubble. Mm-hmm. Something to think about. The other part of this, and I'll take comments on both, you found that with this, particularly topically, that consumption narrowed over time. When we did studies years ago, different domain, we also found consumption narrows over time, but we found if you didn't have the recommender, it narrowed even more. And that people naturally, if they simply find things themselves, learn their tastes, choose to avoid the things they're not interested in. I'm wondering if you thought about the question of whether the narrowing was actually a filter bubble or whether it was simply human narrowing that would have happened with or without the technology.
Okay, so that was a lot of information, so we're going to talk about this after. But I'll try to address the last question / comment. So first of all, I know the study you're referring to, and I thought it was super interesting, but you looked at consumption, we really looked at what the recommender was recommending. So not the consumption of the users per se. We do also in the paper have a comparison with a popularity group, so no learning of preferences at all, and didn't find any narrowing there. Personally, so I try to be neutral about what I call a filter bubble. I maybe should have called it a technological filter bubble. I try to observe it as an attribute of a system, the narrowing, and we found that whether or not it has any consequences for a user, my personal opinion is that it's only normal, right? We started looking at users' recommendations from the moment they joined the platform for the next few months. So if there hadn't been any narrowing, we would have been doing something wrong, right? We're trying to learn their preferences. I was very pleased to see that, so we only found a narrowing in topic variety, and it was very small. So to me, that is evidence of a recommender doing what it's supposed to do, which is learning the user's preferences, but clearly not pushing us into this super dreadful world where there's no discovery, no diversity, no serendipity. And by now I've forgotten the other part, but we'll talk about it later.
Lots of discussion for later, but also discussion for now. I take one question from Slido. Was the analysis focused only on users with large enough click histories or on all users, including cold start users? Did you do something in this regard?
Okay, yeah, so all users started out as cold start users because we started looking at them from the moment they joined the platform, as I just said. We selected a random subset of users. So we did no filtering of very active users versus not at all. Some of our users dropped out of the platform at some point during the study period. We thought it was important to, look at the whole picture, right? Not only the users that are easy or that we're really interested in, but all of them. Hope that answers your question.
It's not my question, but a question that came from Slido. But we'll see. You can look at Slido again. There's another. Okay, we have one in the room. Yes.
Okay, thank you for your good, wonderful talk. And I have a question that generally diversity is also personalized. For example, for one person, the diversity, or for example, a kind of recommendation list, he may think the diversity is high, and for some other side, the person may think the diversity is low. So in your work, which problem are you focusing? For example, your measurement focusing on the system level diversity or personalized level or individual level diversity? Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the question. Let me know if I misunderstood, but I think that's what I meant with the covariate for the user's openness to diversity. So as you said, some users are just more diverse, like their consumption is more diverse, so their behavior is more diverse, so their recommendations will be more diverse. And we wanted to disentangle sort of that effect from any narrowing over time. So that's why we included that into the model as a covariate, to make sure that we didn't capture that effect when we were looking at the decreasing effect over time. So for some users, diversity may have decreased over the time period from 10 topics to 6. I'm just making these numbers up. For others, it might have been from 5 to 4, right? Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah. I'm sorry. So actually, we are currently doing similar work, and for example, in order to evaluate the diversity of the recommendation result, and generally, we may maintain the overall diversity of the entire system, or we may try to develop some kind of skill or technique to maintain some, for example, the individual level, for example, per different customer. For example, so in that sense, we need to use different kind of measurement to measure the diversity of the recommend, for example, the result or something.
We are looking at the individual user's diversity.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. Again, a question with lots of discussion for afterwards. As a matter of time, we have to move to the next speaker. Thanks a lot, Lean again, big hands.